And of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Father in heaven, you are good and glorious and worthy to be praised. You are our Creator, our Redeemer, our Sanctifier, the one who made us and sustains us and gives us all good gifts. We thank you for the good gift of your church, the good gifts of your sacraments, the good gift of St. Thomas Aquinas, whose thinking and theology has inspired so many and helped so many to come to the faith and understand the faith and be formed in the faith and be firmly grounded in the faith. St. Thomas Aquinas, pray for us. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. Well, my name's Bob Hunt, and I appreciate you all coming. I brought my volume of the Summa. One book that I want to recommend, if you're interested in Thomas Aquinas, this is a good place to start. I'll put it up here. It's called Aquinas, Beginner's Guide. By Edward Fesser. I don't remember what he's teaching. Where is he teaching? Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Pasadena City College, California. At least he was when this was published. He's got a lot of stuff on YouTube also, if you're interested in reading his stuff and listening to him. It's a very good introduction to Thomas and to his entire philosophy, not just to the Summa Theologica. So Thomas Aquinas lived from 1224-5. He was either born in the just at the end of 1224 or at the beginning of 1225, and died in 1274. He was a Dominican, so I guess I should give him his credit for that. O.P. He was a Dominican friar. His family didn't want him to become a Dominican friar, so they tempted him with a lovely young woman who suddenly appeared in his room at home. And I think he chased her out with a fire. What are those things called?
Brazier.
Oh, the poker?
Yeah, the fire poker. I think he chased her out with a fire poker. He didn't hurt her. So he wanted to be a priest. They didn't want him to be a priest because, you know, it wasn't a lucrative profession back then. So he was recognized even in his day as a foremost theologian of the church, and died on his way to the Council of Lyon. He had been called by the Pope to participate in the Council of Lyon, and he was on his way there, and he became very ill and died en route. He was a pretty young guy, too. I mean, you can see he was only 49 years old. But that was probably past the average age back then. I don't know. But he became most popular. I mean, he's been renowned for a long time. I don't remember what year he was canonized. But there was a resurgence of Thomistic theology as a result of Pope Leo XIII, who said that Thomas's theology would basically be the foundation of seminary training for priests and theologians in the church. He made that declaration in the last quarter of the 19th century. So there's a lot of interest in Thomas still, and there's a whole bunch of books about him. So there's no shortage of, if you're interested in reading about Thomas Aquinas, there is no shortage of books about him. And happily, some of those books are even helpful in taking what sometimes is very difficult language and make it understandable. I'm going to try to do that here. What I'm going to be discussing over the days that I'm presenting, okay, are Aquinas' demonstrations or proofs for the existence of God. Okay? Thomas's 5 ways. Oh, let me talk about the Summa. the Summa Theologica, I didn't write it up there, but you've got it on your paper. The Summa Theologica. It is a primer, if you can believe that. It is a primer, so it's for beginners in theology. He intended it as a primer for those beginning their study of theology. Okay? And he wrote it, of course, over several years, never finished it because he died before he finished it. But this is the pattern for the Summa. Okay? You will have an article, and that article will include a question that's relevant to the topic that Aquinas is considering. And then he will provide 3 objections. Now, don't be thrown off by the word objection. It sort of means something different for us today. These are actually points that support the position that Aquinas takes in the article. So he will ask a question, okay? He will present a position in favor of a positive position, okay? So he'll take a position on that. And then he'll offer 3 supporting arguments for that position, okay? And then he will say, famously, on the contrary. And then he will provide 3 replies to those arguments, okay? And this is the pattern throughout the entire Summa. All right, and we're going to see that today. All right, so this is going to be kind of an introduction. We're not going to get to the 5 ways today. We're going to kind of set the foundation for it, the way Thomas does. So if you have your copy, we're going to go through this. Okay, so here we are. This is question 2. So the Summa Theologica, question 2, considering the topic, the existence of God. Article 1, whether the existence of God is self-evident. That's the question. Is the existence of God self-evident? In other words, do we just naturally know that God exists? And there's no question that God exists. Is it just simply self-evident? The way that a square has 4 sides is self-evident. By definition, a square has 4 equal sides. If it doesn't have 4 equal sides, it's not a square. Okay? So, we proceed thus to the first article. It seems that the existence of God is self-evident. So this is Thomas's point. He's making this argument. It seems that the existence of God is self-evident. So that's the position he's taken, or he's presenting. He doesn't take that position. He actually takes the opposite. But that's the position he's presenting. So he's going to provide 3 arguments in favor of that position. Objection 1, or argument 1, if you might say. Now those things are said to be self-evident to us, the knowledge of which is natural to us, as we can see in regard to first principles. But as Damascene says, the knowledge of God is naturally implanted in all. Therefore, the existence of God is self-evident. Now, let's break that apart a little bit. Don't be intimidated by the language. Let's break it apart a little bit. Things are said to be self-evident to us, the knowledge of which is natural to us. Okay? So, again, we know that we exist. All right? We know that we exist. All right? If a student famously asked the professor, prove to me, this philosophy professor, prove to me that I exist. And the philosopher responded, who's asking the question? The only answer is, I am. So it is self-evident that I exist. Because if I didn't exist, I couldn't ask the question. If it's self-evident that I exist. So, the knowledge of which is natural in us, as we can see in regard to first principles. What are first principles? First principles are those foundational things that we just kind of know intuitively. So, for instance, one of the examples that Thomas uses is that all people desire what is to their benefit. Everybody desires what is to their benefit, okay? Or what they think is to their benefit. Nobody desires their own self-destruction. Even suicides, okay, they commit suicide because of one of two things. They're either despondent, okay, and so they think death is better than life, so they're trying to escape something that they perceive to be worse even than death, or they're simply mentally ill, and they can't understand what's going on, and that changes the whole equation, okay? But for healthy, normal people, everyone desires what is beneficial for them, okay? Nobody desires their own evil. That nobody desires their own suffering, okay? Who is Damascene? Damascene is John Damascene, St. John Damascene. He was one of the fathers of the church, the last father of the church, if you will, of the East. He was 700s. The knowledge of God is naturally implanted in all. Well, that's what Damascene says. Therefore, the existence of God is self-evident. All right, so that's the first argument that Thomas offers to prove that the existence of God is self-evident. Okay, now the second argument. Further, those things are said to be self-evident, which are known as soon as the terms are known, which the philosopher says is true of the first principles of demonstration. What? Okay, who's the philosopher? Anybody? Who's the philosopher? Aristotle. Okay, Aristotle. Aristotle was so revered in scholastic theology and Middle Age philosophy that they didn't even use his name. They just called him the philosopher. So if you ever read, when you're reading Thomas and he talks about the philosopher, that's Aristotle. Okay? The first principles of demonstration. Well, what does that mean? Again, something that we know intuitively. And he gives an example. Thus, when the nature of a whole and a part is known, it is at once known that every whole is greater than its part. So if you know, what is that? So let's say that we have a pie here. Okay? Here's a part of a pie. If you understand what a part of something is, and you understand what a whole is, then you intuitively understand that the whole is greater than the part. Because that's what a part is by definition. It's a part of the whole. So the whole has to be bigger than the part. Does that make sense? Okay? Just like, my whole hand is bigger than my pinky. My pinky is a part of my body, but the whole body is greater than the pinky. Now, my whole body might not be as great as Jean's pinky, but that's All right, so we understand that part now. So we understand this intuitively. If you know what a part is, and you know what a whole is, then you know that the whole is greater than the part. If you don't know that, then you don't understand yet the difference between a part and a whole. Because if you understand the difference, you know that the whole is greater than the part. All right. But as soon as the meaning of the word God is understood, so if we really understand what we mean by God, it is at once seen that God exists. For by this word is signified that thing than which nothing greater can be conceived. That is the classic Western philosophical definition of God. That thing than which nothing greater can be conceived. But that which exists actually and in the intellect is greater than that which exists only in the intellect. Therefore, since as soon as the word God is understood, it exists in the intellect, it also follows that it exists actually. Therefore, the proposition God exists is self-evident. If you've ever taken a philosophy class, you will recognize this pretty immediately as what is called the ontological argument. The ontological argument. The most famous proponent of this was Saint Anselm. Descartes was kind of fond of it too. All right, so basically this is the argument. Since God is greater than anything, and since existence is greater, it's greater to actually exist than it is to theoretically exist, then God must exist, because God is the greatest thing, and existence is greater than theory. Existence in reality is greater than existence in theory. That's kind of the that's pretty much the ontological argument, okay? Since it's greater to exist in reality than to exist in theory, and God is the greatest thing that exists, greater than anything else, then he must actually exist. Now, if you're not too terribly impressed with that argument, don't worry, Thomas isn't either. Further, the existence of truth is self-evident. Again, something else that's self-evident. For whoever denies the existence of truth grants that truth does not exist. And if truth does not exist, then the proposition, truth does not exist, is true. And if there is anything true, there must be truth. You know the whole thing, there is no such thing as absolute truth. Are you absolutely sure? If you're absolutely sure, then there's at least one absolute truth. And if it is true that there's no such thing as truth, then the statement, there's no such thing as truth, must be true. So there's truth. And that is self-evident. That's what Thomas means by self-evident. Are you getting it? Okay? But God is truth itself. So he says if there is anything true, even the statement there is no truth, if even that's true, if anything is true, then truth exists. And we know that there are things that are true. But if God is truth itself, I am the way, the truth, and the life, therefore God exists, is self-evident. All right. Then Thomas continues. On the contrary, no one can think the opposite of what is self-evident. As the philosopher states concerning the first principles of demonstration. But the opposite of the proposition, God exists, can be thought. For this fool says in his heart, there is no God. Therefore, that God exists is not self-evident. Because there are people out there who genuinely, sincerely hold the proposition that God does not exist, and they're not insane. Does that make sense? And they're not insane. They're rational, logical, reasonable people. Okay? So again, if you deny the existence of truth, you're insane. You're crazy. You either don't understand the concept because you're intellectually deficient, or you don't understand the concept because you're mentally deficient. Because it's self-evident. You see what I'm saying? If you continue to deny what is self-evident, then you're just lying. Then you're just trying to score points on the internet. You're not being honest. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to know if there's something here that having faith, faith is not mentioned, or he has not mentioned, just you believe in God because you have faith.
We're going to get there.
Oh, okay, I'm too early.
You're too early.
Oh.
But that's okay. That's a wonderful segue. I'll cue you when we're getting there.
Okay, I just thought, this guy just doesn't have faith in God.
Yes, we're getting there.
Okay,
We are getting there.
thank you.
All right, so now, page 2. Reply to the first objection. And again, don't get thrown by, there's this on the contrary. Reply to the first objection. So Aquinas is going to reply to that first argument. What's the first argument? That now those things are said to be self-evident to us, the knowledge of which is natural in us, as we can regard the knowledge of God as naturally implanted in us. To know that God exists in general, and in a general and confused way, is implanted in us by nature. He acknowledges that. So, to know that God exists in a general and confused way, not in a clear way, or in a specific way, is implanted in us by nature, since God is man's happiness. Okay? That's self-evident. For man naturally desires happiness. And what is naturally desired by man must be naturally known to him. So what we were talking about. Everybody desires their own happiness. What is beneficial to them. No one desires their own suffering. Okay? No one who is healthy desires their own suffering. No one who is healthy and honest desires their own suffering. Okay? Isn't it a shame we have to say these things because of the world we live in today? No one who is healthy and honest desires their own suffering. Okay? And in this way, okay, we know that God exists. The existence of God, the understanding of God is implanted in us because God is happiness. This, however, the problem is we don't recognize it as God. There are some people who don't recognize that as God. This, however, is not to know absolutely that God exists. Just as to know that someone is approaching is not the same to know that Peter is approaching. So you hear footsteps in the distance. Who is that? It's somebody, but you don't know who it is. So in the same sense, our happiness, our intuitive desire for happiness that is implanted in us is there. And it's God. But some people don't recognize it as God. In the same way that they don't recognize, they hear the footsteps, they know someone's coming, but they don't know who it is. For there are many who imagine that man's perfect good, which is happiness, consists in riches, and others in pleasure, and others in something else. So this happiness that is implanted in us, that is God, is often confused with other things that we think give us happiness. Riches, pleasure. Yes, sir?
Aren't you just really, though, just changing the definition? You say, I like it, therefore it must be God. Isn't that what we're doing? We're just naming what we like as God.
Yes.
If pleasure, it makes us feel good, and our whatever our pleasure is God.
Exactly, we are. That's exactly what we're doing, but that still doesn't change the fact that what we are identifying as God is not the God who is God.
Yeah, that's exactly
Okay?
my point. Yeah.
All right. So I could be pretending to be Gene. I don't know why I would do that. Okay? I could be pretending to be Gene. All right. And I could, replace my identity with his. But it doesn't change. It doesn't make me Gene.
You'd be better looking, though.
I beg your pardon?
You'd be a lot better looking.
Wow. Excuse me. Can you reach up there and pull that out? I can't quite get it. Thank you. I try so hard. So there we go. So yes, we recognize that intuitive happiness, okay, we recognize that it's there, and Thomas says it's there, but we get it confused with other things, so we don't recognize that it's God. So and Thomas says because of that, the existence of God is not self-evident. The existence of our desire for happiness is self-evident, but not that that is God. All right, second, reply to the second argument. Perhaps not everyone who hears this word God understands it to signify something than which nothing greater can be thought, seeing that some have believed God to be a body. So they've thought that God is something less than the God who is God. Yet granted, this is not far from the point that you just made. Yes, yet granted that everyone understands that by this word God is signified something. So he's even going to grant. Okay, so he says, at first he says, it's not necessarily true that everybody understands what is meant by God. Okay, as that which is greater than all. But then he goes and says, okay, so even if everyone understands, but that by this word God is signified something than which nothing greater can be thought, nevertheless, it does not therefore follow that he understands that what the word signifies exists actually, but only that it exists in the intellect. Nor can it be argued that it actually exists unless it be admitted that there actually exists something than which nothing greater can be thought. And this is what is not admitted by those who hold that God does not exist. So basically what he is saying here, very in simplest terms, the fact that there are atheists out there means, and that these people are not mentally ill, they are not being dishonest, they are not intellectually deprived, they are reasonable, rational, healthy, honest people. Their existence demonstrates that the existence of God is not self-evident, because it's not self-evident to them, and they're not intellectually or mentally deficient or being dishonest. They really hold that. They are genuine in that. And because you cannot deny what is self-evident unless you are intellectually, mentally deficient or being dishonest, all right? Then the fact that there are people who are not mentally or intellectually deficient and are honest, deny the existence of God, means that it's not self-evident. Does that make sense? Okay? Their very existence means that it's not self-evident. Richard Dawkins, for instance, he is not intellectually deficient. He's a spectacularly intelligent man. He is not mentally deficient. You know, his IQ is probably in the 140s. And I, at least, in listening, I don't think he's being dishonest. I think he genuinely holds for the non-existence of God. Okay? So, but you can't do that about things that are self-evident. Okay? You can't do that because you can't deny the existence of truth. You can't deny your own existence. Does that make sense? How I can stand, if I stood up here and said, I don't exist, okay, one of three things would go through your mind, okay? Well, one of two things. The intellectual deficiency wouldn't apply. One of two things would go through your mind, right? Either you're thinking Bob is crazy, or Bob's playing a joke or something. He's not being honest, okay? But you would not conclude that I actually believe, or I actually hold that I don't exist. Yes?
There is a third option.
What's the third option?
The third option is that I'm dreaming you, all y'all exist, and none of you exist.
Yes.
And then I just dreamed you said that.
Yes,
Like
but that's...
am I a man dreaming I'm a butterfly, or am I a butterfly dreaming I'm a man?
Yeah, but we're talking about you rejecting your own existence.
Oh, okay. So,
Okay.
sorry.
Now, you can reject my existence, okay? What is that? Why is that funny? respect I get from you people.
I don't understand why
I
it's
don't-
funny either.
I don't-
I'm sure it could make me crazy, I think, since you're obviously
Exactly.
there.
Exactly. So you can exist, you can deny my existence, but you can't deny my existence while at the same time carrying on a conversation with me. Okay? Because if you are, then you're mentally deficient or you're lying.
Well, then I must be, because I carry on conversations in my dreams with people who I know don't really exist.
Well, that's your dreams. That's
Oh,
something else.
you mean,
That's something else. We're not talking about the dream world here.
oh, yeah, could be.
All right. So is everybody with me? Is everybody with Thomas so far? Okay. Finally, the third reply, the reply to objection 3, the existence of truth in general is self-evident, but the existence of a first truth is not self-evident. So the existence of truth is self-evident. Okay? Truth exists. We know this because if truth does not exist, then the statement, truth does not exist, is true. So truth has to exist. So the fact that truth exists is self-evident. But the fact that a first truth exists is not self-evident. And God is self-evident truth. All right. Man, I'm going to work out up here. It's hot in this room. Are you hot? I'm
I was
hot.
about to say, school's back in session, should have the AC.
Oh, there's a
Fan on. Turn the fan on.
Gosh, do you think I'm loud enough to go over the fan?
Have no fear. We have faith in you.
Very quiet.
Oh no, it's oscillating.
It's oscillating.
Let's turn the oscillator off.
Oh, please don't blow a fan on Bernadette, she gets cold at 90 degrees.
There we go.
I'm with you, Bert.
That's better. I feel better already. I'm glad nobody's sending down wind from me.
You got the tray?
He's gonna give up.
All right. Oh, I forgot. This is my last presentation, by the way. Yes,
Going back over all of this,
Yes.
is Thomas Aquinas, is this, do you think, his own thoughts of all of this? I mean, this is so deep.
ma'am.
Or is this specifically inspired through the Holy Spirit?
I think
I think for a
both.
human to go into all of this is,
Yeah, well, as a student of philosophy, I would say it's Thomas inspired by Aristotle. Okay? And several others, of course. But as a man of faith, I would definitely say that the Holy Spirit is involved. Because for one person to put out such work, I mean, that's enormous. It's enormous.
so the
Yeah.
same thing perhaps for Aristotle and all of the others.
I think so. I don't think there's any reason not to hold that Aristotle could have been God's instrument, building that foundation. Absolutely. Absolutely. Truth is of God. All truth is of God. Wherever that truth comes from, whether it's from the pagan Greeks, whether it's from the pagan Romans, whether it's from Zoroastrian, or whether it's from, the little Baptist evangelical minister in San Marcos, Texas. Truth is truth, and all truth is of God. And God can use various instruments to communicate His truth. Okay? And the Catholic Church, for one, has always recognized that we ought to recognize and appreciate the truth that comes to us even from non-Christian sources. St. Paul quotes pagan sources in his letters. Or rather, no, the letter of Jude quotes pagan sources. Okay? He quotes a pagan poem. Okay? In his poem. So truth is truth, and all truth comes from God. Okay? So can the Holy Spirit use Aristotle to build that foundation, to create a foundation on which Thomas built? Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, so then we come to Article 2. So this is question 2, or whether it can be demonstrated that God exists. We proceed thus to the second article. It seems that the existence of God cannot be demonstrated. Okay? So, here's a little clue, if you haven't picked up on it yet. The first position that Thomas presents, okay, is almost always the position that he eventually is going to argue against. So, it seems that the existence of God cannot be demonstrated. That's the position that Thomas is presenting. He is eventually going to come around to argue against that conclusion. Okay? But first, he provides 3 arguments in favor of the proposition that the existence of God cannot be demonstrated. The first argument, for it is an article of faith. Here you go, Dorothy. Here you go. For it is an article of faith that God exists. But what is of faith cannot be demonstrated, because a demonstration produces knowledge, while faith is of the unseen. Okay? And he quotes the letter to the Hebrews there. Okay? Therefore, it cannot be demonstrated that God exists. And I wrote in there this little quip that somebody wrote, that an atheist had written in a comment that I read on the internet. If there were evidence of God's existence, you wouldn't need faith. Okay? So that's interesting. So, and here I have to apologize because I neglected to put the second objection in there. I wasn't going to get into it, but I decided I would. So let me just go ahead and read it from the book itself. Basically, this one says that in order to demonstrate the existence of something, you have to know the essence of that thing. So he says, further, essence is the middle term of demonstration. Don't worry about that. But we cannot know in what God's essence consists, okay, but solely in what it does not consist. As Damascene,